Hi guys, it's Ali, and today we are going to be discussing how to choose which book to write. I'm currently working on a young adult fantasy that I've been working on for years, so I am very deep into my commitment for this one particular work in progress. But before I actually sat down to write this specific project, I had a bunch of different options to choose from, and I had to decide which book at the time I wanted to pursue writing. In talking to some of my writer friends lately, this has been a kind of topic of conversation of what book to choose when you have a bunch of different ideas, which one do you pursue? And that's something that I have not had to deal with in a while. Obviously, I've had to deal with like plot bunnies popping up quite often, but I have long since made my choice on which book I am pursuing to write first. So I wanted to kind of revisit the way that I chose this book and also include some other potential ways that you might be able to figure it out because I know that it's very hard. So here are some, oh, hi Ginny. Here are 5 tips that hopefully will help make your decision a little bit easier. The first tip for choosing a book to write is to go with the project that you feel the most drawn to. I specifically don't say which one you like the most, because obviously if you've had all of these different ideas, then you like them, and I'm gonna bet that you kind of like them all pretty equally. And that is kind of where a lot of people's advice starts and ends with this particular topic, is just, well, write the one that you want to write. And it's much more complicated than that. So in this case, I would say the first step would be to see if you do have a particular draw towards one project over another. This might be that one of your projects is a fantasy and one is a contemporary, and since you read more fantasy, you have more experience with it, and you feel a little bit more drawn to that story. That was one of the reasons why I chose my particular young adult fantasy rather than pursuing a contemporary that I also have in my folders of potential story ideas. So that is the first and best way to decide, but there is very often going to be a situation where you don't have one that you feel particularly drawn to over the other. You love all of your stories, you love all of your characters, obviously, so you might need a little bit more than that. So let's move on to the second tip, in case this first one doesn't quite do it for you. This second tip is also pretty self-explanatory, and it is to choose the story that you have the most work for currently. So if you have been working on one story off and on, and you have a bunch of thought dumping stuff for it, and you just have this whole big massive folder with stuff, and then you have a newer, fresher idea that you're really excited about, but you don't have as much work for it, then logic would dictate that you should probably go with the story that you have more work for. Obviously, the new story is going to be fresh and exciting, but if you have more work, you have a more solid foundation to actually get started writing on this particular project, so it is going to be a better bet to go with the story you have more stuff for. But Ali, I hear you saying, what if I have about equal amounts of stuff for multiple different ideas, and I don't have one that I am more drawn to than the other? Well, then let's move on to tip number 3. This is where we're going to start getting a little bit more logical in our thinking and my tip making, because if you don't have a personal or emotional draw to a story, or if you don't have more experience with one story over another, then you might need to start getting into more logical ways of thinking to decide which story you want to choose. That being said, tip number 3 is to look at your work in progress options and see which ones are most likely going to be a series and which ones are most likely going to be standalones. From a newbie author standpoint, it can be a little bit more freeing to write a standalone first, because not only is it going to be a little bit more manageable for you, because you don't need to worry about long-term character arcs and long-term plot arcs and all of those little plot arcs and character arcs in between each individual book. It's just all contained in one thing, so that can be a little bit more manageable for a newbie author. But also, from a publishing standpoint, it is generally going to be a safer idea for a publisher to take a newbie author's book as a standalone than as a first book in a series, because it's just a little bit less risky from a publishing and a marketing standpoint. That is definitely not true of everybody. That is not to say don't write your fantasy series, whatever. I'm writing a fantasy series, but if you have different options and those are your choices, maybe a standalone might be a good place to start. If you have a bunch of different standalones or a bunch of different series and not one of the other, then let's move on to the next one. Tip number 4 is to consider the different genres that your potential works in progress fall under. Different genres have different kind of expectations, tropes, and subgenres that are associated with that main genre. For example, if you're writing a true romance, the idea is that you are going to have 2 characters fall in love and be together by the end of the story. If you are writing a high fantasy, then you are probably going to expect there to be some form of magic or elves or other magical folk. These different genres and the different expectations of that genre will dictate a little bit about how your writing process is going to go. If you have 2 different stories that have vastly different genres or subgenres or anything like that, then it is a good idea to go through what the different expectations are for those genres and figure out which one is more manageable or more attractive to you. Growing up, I always felt like I wasn't good enough yet to write the stories that I wanted to write, and I always felt like I needed to shelve the idea and wait until I was a better writer. That's never the case. You never feel like a good enough writer to start writing your dream story, but it is worth noting that sometimes things are going to feel more manageable. I'd written tons of fantasy ideas and blurbs and things like that just over the years, and so I felt a little bit more suited to writing a fantasy first because it was something that I had a little bit more familiarity with, aside from already having more content for that and already feeling more of a draw to that story because it's more alike to what I read. The exact opposite might be true for you, so maybe you feel most comfortable writing in contemporary or writing in romance or writing in supernatural or anything like that. So whatever you feel most comfortable with, that is always going to be a good place to start for your first work in progress. Writing is always going to be a challenge, but it is worth noting that if you have no idea which story to write even after these previous tips, then it can be beneficial to think about, well, you know what, I think I have the most experience writing in this type of thing, or the exact opposite. You know what, I have so much experience writing this kind of thing, I want to write this other thing for the challenge. And so all of those things might partake in your decision making, but what you end up deciding with that is up to you. I'm just giving you the kind of frame of mind to maybe think of it in that more logical way. However, if all else fails and you still have not been able to narrow down to one story, then my final tip is to look at the publishing industry. Now, this is not going to apply to everyone, so if you are someone who is pursuing self-publishing, then this might not be the tip for you. I apologize, but if you are pursuing traditional publishing and you still have not been able to figure out which story to write through all of these previous 4 tips, let me make it clear that I think this is the last resort. I don't think you should write to the market. I think you should write the book you want to write, but I do want to give you this option of thinking about this if you still need one last little shove to get you in the direction of one story over another. But I want to make it clear, this should not be your first choice. This should be the tip that you use if all of the others fail. Like in any industry, there are trends in publishing, and so you are going to have a higher chance of success with a story that fits the trends that publishing is currently looking for. So think back to when Twilight first came out. Remember how many supernatural romances came out after that? How many werewolves and vampires and all of that different supernatural kind of stuff came out into the market because of the major success of Twilight? Well, same thing happened with Hunger Games. After the Hunger Games came out, we saw this huge boom of the dystopian genre. And so, of course, there are going to be more opportunities for people who have a story that is falling into one of those current market trends. Of course, you should never just look at the current market trends and come up with an idea and write that idea just because it is something that is popular right now. You should always be passionate about the story that you're going to write, because writing is hard enough when you are passionate about it. Just imagine trying to write a story that you don't actually give a crap about. But that being said, if you are really lost on which story to choose and you happen to have a story idea already in the works that is something that is relatively popular in your current state, then that is a good idea to maybe pursue that idea, because you already are passionate about it, you already like it, you've already come up with it yourself, it's an original idea. You're just pursuing that one because it might have more opportunities for it once you actually finish it up. That is a complete, cold, callous way of choosing which book to write, but I do think that it is a good last-ditch resort because if you are pursuing traditional publishing, then it is something that you want to keep in mind. After the huge boom of supernatural romance that we saw with Twilight and the huge boom in dystopians that we saw with The Hunger Games, there in both cases was this kind of feeling of being tired of that genre. There was a long period of time where supernatural romance was not as popular after that huge boom had kind of faded away. And the same thing happened with dystopians. Everything has cycles. Even now we're seeing some of those supernatural romances start to pop back up and gain some more popularity, but there is a cycle to these things. So if you have a supernatural romance that you have been sitting on for years because nobody wanted to read a supernatural romance, then now that those are starting to pick up might be a good time to start seriously working on that idea. Or vice versa, if you are currently in this huge boom of dystopians or whatever, then you might want to get that book out before people start getting tired of that genre. That is a totally business-like way of looking at a creative endeavor like writing, but again, if you can't choose something with the more emotional or personal side of things, like the first couple tips, then you do want to start thinking a little bit more logically, and then if the logic doesn't even work, then you need to start thinking a little bit cold and calculated. So that is why this is my final tip. I hope nobody has to get to this point to decide which book they would like to write. Like I said, I pretty much made my decision after the first two, but that is not going to be the case for everybody, and I think choosing which book to write is a lot harder than a lot of people make it out to be, especially if you're like me and you have a billion stories kind of buzzing in your head constantly. So I hope this video was able to help you get an idea of which book to write. If you had 2 ideas you were going between, I hope this video has helped you choose one over the other. And if you had 20 ideas, then I hope this video has helped you at least narrow down your prospects substantially, and good luck to you because I feel you. And other than that, that is going to be it for me this week. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, and if you like my content, do subscribe and ring the notification bell, because that's pretty much the only way that people can be subscribed to anyone anymore on YouTube. And I will see you guys in the next video.